we are going to talk about token-based authentication. For that, you'll first learn about the differences between authentication and authorization, because these two concepts, even though are simple, a lot of developers have a hard time distinguishing them from each other. Then next, you'll learn about the differences between the traditional and the token-based authentication. And we'll use the Entity Framework core to set up the token-based authentication as well. Like for example, to create the tables, to store the user-related data, and to also get data from the database. You'll learn about generating access and refresh tokens, and also how to generate an access token when it expires using a refresh token. By the end of this course, you'll also learn about role-based authentication. So, let's get started. Authentication and authorization are two really important concepts when it comes to secure your web API applications, but also your applications in general. Even though these two concepts sound similar to each other, they are different. Now, per definition, authentication is the process of validating the identity of a registered user who is accessing a service or an application. And authorization is the process of validating authenticated users if they have permissions to access a certain service or an application. So, authentication is the process of verifying the existence of a user, and authorization is the process of verifying the permissions of an existing user. But to understand this better, let us talk about a real-world example. Let us think of a company building. Within this building, you can have different offices, like for example the manager office, the programmer office, etc. And in this company, you have different employees, or let us say different users. Some users or employees are managers, some others are programmers, etc. And these users or employees can enter the building. So they all have access to the building. So they are all authenticated to enter the building because the building system is aware of their credentials. But depending on the role within the company, they can access different rooms or offices. And this is when authorization comes into place. So for example, the managers are authorized to access the manager's offices. Employees or programmers are allowed or authorized to access their offices. But they cannot go to managers' offices without a certain permission. So authentication is to be able to access the building, and authorization is to have permission or to be authorized to access certain areas within this building. When it comes to adding authentication to your apps, you can use different ways. You can either add cookie-based authentication, which is the traditional way of authenticating users in your apps, or you can add a more modern way named token-based authentication. But what are the main differences between the traditional and the token-based authentication? The traditional authentication is also known as cookie-based authentication or even server-based authentication because a session is securely created by the server and stored in the server's memory. And this authentication type works this way. So you typically have a browser and a server. Then when you want to authenticate the users, you send a POST request to, let's say, the Authenticate API endpoint by providing the username and password. Then this server will check if these credentials exist in the database. And if they exist, a session is securely created by the server and stored in the server's memory. Then this server will send back a session which gets stored in a cookie in the user's browser. And then if the user wants to get some data from the API, along with the request, the cookie with the session ID is passed in the request, which then gets verified by the server, and the data is returned in an HTTP 200 OK response. The same way in the token-based authentication, we have a browser and a server. When you want to authenticate a user, you send a POST request to the server, let's say to the Authenticate API endpoint, and you provide the username and password. The server will then check if the username and password exist in the database. Then it returns a token and a refresh token, which are two random encoded strings which store user-related information. Token is generated using a secret key on the server, and that is the only data that we store in the server. So the token and the refresh token do not get stored in a cookie, but in the browser's memory. And then if you want to get data from the server, let's say you want to get data from the data API endpoint, in the request, you also have the authorization header, and you have the bearer and the token value. The server, by using the mechanism that you set up in the server side, it checks if the token is valid. And if the token is valid, it returns some data. Now, in comparison to the cookie-based authentication, this session has an expiry time. But the expiry time in the cookie-based authentication is higher than in the token-based authentication. The expiration time in the tokens is typically 5 to 10 minutes. So after 10 minutes, even if your token gets stolen, the malicious user will not be able to access your data. So after the token has expired, you need to use the refresh token to generate a new token which you can use to access data. So you would send a POST request to, let's say, the refresh token API endpoint and pass as a parameter the refresh token, and then the server will generate a new token which you can use to get data. Now on the upcoming parts, you'll learn how to generate a token, how to generate a refresh token, and how to get a new token using the refresh token. And the new token is stored the same way in the user's browser. Now, a token is just a complex string which stores information that can be understood by the server. But why would you use token-based authentication over the cookie-based authentication? The first reason is scalability. In the session-based authentication, because the sessions are stored in the server's memory, scaling becomes an issue when there is a huge number of users using the system at the same time. But in the token-based authentication, this issue does not exist because the tokens get stored on the client side. Another reason is because in the token-based authentication, you can support multiple devices. In the cookie-based authentication, the cookies normally work on a single domain or subdomains, and they are normally disabled by browser if they work cross-domain. So let us say, for example, you want to access this server from a third-party app like an Angular, React, a mobile device, etc. So there are different issues when the APIs are served from a different domain to the mobile or web devices. In the token-based authentication, there is no issue with cookies as the JWT or the token is included in the request header. So the token-based authentication is the more recommended method in the modern web apps. But there is one drawback with the token-based authentication is because the token is much bigger compared with the session ID stored in a cookie because the tokens contain more user information. Now, before we move to the next parts, let us talk about a really important concept in the token-based authentication. The most important concept in token-based authentication is the JWT or the JSON Web Token. And we are going to use the JSON Web Token throughout this course, but before we move to the next parts, let us have a look at the JWT. And JWT or the JSON Web Token, per definition, is an open standard that defines a compact and self-contained way for securely transmitting information between parties as a JSON object. Now we are going to use the JSON Web Token throughout this course, but before we move to the next part, let us have a look at the JWT structure. A JWT contains three base64 encoded strings that are separated by dots. A typical token or a JWT looks like this. It has three sections separated by dots. In the first section we have the header, in the other section we have the payload, and in the last section we have the signature. Now the header has generally two parts: the type of the token, which is JWT, and the signing algorithm that is used to encode the token. So an example would be this JSON object. Now this JSON object is base64 URL encoded to form the first part of the JWT. The second part of the token is the payload, which contains the claims. And claims are just statements about an entity, which typically is a user, and additional data. There are three types of claims. You have the registered claims, the public claims, and the private claims. An example of the claims JSON object would be this one, and then this payload is base64 URL encoded to form the second part of the JWT. The last part is the signature of the JWT. To create this signature part, you have to take the encoded header, then you need the encoded payload and a secret, and then to sign this part, the algorithm specified in the header is used. When you have a token and you want to see the details of that token, you can navigate to this URL. And here then you can go to debugger, and here on the left you have the encoded token value, which is separated using dots in three sections. So we have the header, we have the payload, and we have the signature. And then here on the right you have the decoded value. So for the header we have the algorithm type SH256, and the type of the token is JSON Web Token. Then here on the payload we have the subject, we have the name, and then we have the expiration time. And if you scroll down in here, you have the signature. And we have said that the signature is a combination of the base64 URL encoded header plus payload and a secret which you can modify. So if I type new in here, you'll see that here I have, for example, S5W, then I add some other text. You see that the last part is also updated. So far, you have learned about the importance of the token-based authentication, and on the upcoming parts you'll learn how to configure token-based authentication in the Web API application that we have used so far. The first step to doing so will be to add the identity-related tables to the database. But we are not going to manually create the identity tables one by one. Instead, we are going to use the identity framework to create the default identity-related tables. For that, let us go to Visual Studio and see it in action. In Visual Studio, the first thing that we are going to do is that we are going to create a new model that we are going to use for the identity. Now, creating a new model is not necessary, but I'm creating a new model which inherits from the identity user base model, which is the default class used by the identity framework. So in here, I'll just go to the Solution Explorer, and then in here, I'll just go inside the data folder, and in the models, I'll just create a new class. So add a class. I'm going to name this model Application User, and I click the Add button. And then in the Application User, I'll just inherit from the base class Identity User. Now I'll just import the namespace for the identity user, and the namespace for the identity user is the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity. And here, before I add a custom property for the application user, I'll just go to the identity user. So I'll just right click and then go to definition. Then here I'll just right click in the identity user and then just go to definition one more time. And in here you can see all the default columns or the default properties that come with the identity user base class. So in here, for example, you have the phone number, the email confirmed, the email, normalized email, etc. Now, if you want, you can just directly use the identity user, or you can add a custom class the same way that we did in here by adding the application user and inherit from the base class identity user. And then in here, each property that you define will be added as a separate column in the application user table. So for that, I'll just type in here prop, and then I'll define the type to be string. And I'm just going to name this one custom because we're just creating this property for testing purposes. So I'll just name it custom and leave it that way. Now let us go to the Solution Explorer, and then here go to the app.db context file. And then the only thing that we need to change in here is that instead of inheriting from the DB context, we are going to inherit from the identity DB context. So basically just in front of the DB context, we are adding identity. And inheriting from this base class is going to create all the default tables. And then as a parameter, this is generic, so the parameter is going to be the application user class that we just created. Now, if you don't want to use the application user model, you can just use the base class identity user, and that is going to create a table with the default properties that I just showed. So if you go to the app.db context.cs, and here let us add the namespace for the identity DB context, and for that we need to install the ASP.NET Core.identity.entity framework core. Now for that, I'll just go to tools, and then here go to the NuGet package manager, and the second option, manage NuGet packages for solution. In here, I'll search for the identity.entity framework core, and then in here select the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.identity.entity framework core. Then here I'll just select the my books project. From the versions in here, I'll select the 5.0.2 because that is the version of my entity framework core, and then click install. Then I'll just accept the licenses. And now that the package was installed, let us just go back to the app.db context file. And in here, I'll just import the namespace, and that is the ASP.NET Core.identity.entity framework core. So now we can see that the errors are gone, but since we added a new model, we need to reflect this change in our database. So for that, we need to add a new migration. Let us go to the package manager console. And then I'm going to name this migration identity edit, and then press enter. So here we see that we get an error, and the error says that the entity type identity user login string requires a primary key, etc. Now to resolve this issue, you can just go to the inside on model creating, and then here just after the last model builder definition, you can just type base.on model creating, and then pass as a parameter the model builder. Now let us save the changes. You can remove the extra space from here, and then just go to the package manager console, and then I'll run the same command one more time. So the add migration identity edit, and now we can see that everything worked as expected because the entity framework core created the identity edit partial class, and that inherits from the migration, and it has the same name as the migration name. Now inside the up method, we see that the migration builder is going to create multiple tables, and the first table is the ASP.NET roles, which has 4 columns, the ID name, normalized name, and the concurrency stamp. Then down here we have another table, the ASP.NET users, and in the ASP.NET users you can see that we have the custom column that we defined in the application user model. You'll see that we have other tables like the ASP.NET role claims, and then down here we have the ASP.NET user claims, etc. Now to apply this change to the database, you can just type in here update dash database. So we see that the database was updated. Now if you want to verify, you can just go to the Server Explorer and then go inside the database, then inside the tables folder. You can see that we have all of these new tables that start with the ASP.NET. So we have the ASP.NET role claims, the roles, user claims, user logins, user roles, users, and the user tokens. Now that we have created the identity related tables, we are going to configure authentication. So for that, let us go to Visual Studio and see it in action. The first thing that we need to do in Visual Studio is that we need to install a new package. So for that, I'll just go to Tools, then NuGet Package Manager, and Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. Then in here, I'll search for ASP.NET Core. So ASP.NET Core.Authentication, and then .jwt beer. Then I'll select the first option. Then here on the right, select the My Books project. From the drop down, I'll install the version 5.0.2 because that is the Entity Framework Core version in the My Books project, and then click Install. Then I'll just accept the license. And now that the package is installed, I'll just go to the Solution Explorer, and then in here go to the app settings.json file. In here I'm going to create a new section which is going to store the authentication related data. So I'll just scroll down in here, and just after the connection strings, I'll just create a new section. I'll name this section JWT, and then inside this section I'll store the valid audience, and I'll just set the valid audience to be just user. Then the valid issuer. Now in here you can basically just use any value you want, so I'll just use the localhost URL. For that, I'll just go to the Solution Explorer, then just right click, and then here go to Properties, and then here go to Debug, then scroll down in here, and I'll just copy this value. Then go back to the app settings.json file and paste the value in here. But the most important part is the secret key, because we said that in the token-based authentication, the only thing that we store in the server is the secret key. So in here, I'll just type secret key or just secret, and the value needs to be a string, at least 16 chars long. So I'll just type in here, this is just let's say secret key, and then maybe add here, and then save the changes, and then just remove the extra space. Let us save the changes one more time. Now let us go to the Solution Explorer, and we need to go to the Startup.cs file. Now in here, scroll down to the configure services method, and then in here, just before the add swagger gen method, we are going to add the authentication. The first thing that you need to add is that you need to add the identity configuration, so add identity. The second part is going to be to add the authentication, so add authentication related code. And the last part is going to be the JWT related code, because we need to use the JWT bearer related code to validate the token that will come from the front end, or in our case, it will come from the Postman. So that is going to be the third step. That is to add the JWT bearer. Now to add identity, it's really simple. You can just type in your services and .add identity. And this is a generic method, so you need to pass two parameters. The first parameter is going to be the table that you want to use to store the user-related data, and that is in our case the application user table or the application user model. So I'll just import the namespace for the application user, and that is the data.models. And the second property is the model that you use to store the user roles. And since we didn't modify the default implementation, that is the identity role class. So I'll just import the namespace, and that is the ASP.NET Core.identity. Then next, I'm just going to type in here .add entity framework core stores, because we are using the entity framework core to work with identity related data. And the DB context file is the app DB context. And the last method that you need to use is the .add default token providers. Now let us define the authentication part. So for that in here, I'm just going to type services .add authentication. Then in here we are going to define a couple of options. So for that I'll just type in here options, then go to, and then down here the first option will be the options.default authentication scheme, and the default authentication scheme is going to be the JWT bearer defaults dot, let us import the namespace for the JWT, and that is the ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt bearer, which is the package that we install. And then here dot authentication scheme. The second option is going to be options.default challenge scheme, that is going to be JWT bearer defaults authentication scheme, and the last property is going to be the options.default scheme, and the default scheme is going to be JWT bearer defaults authentication scheme. Now that is all you need to do in the add authentication. The third section is going to be to add the JWT bearer related code. So for that, add JWT bearer, and here we are going to also define some options. So we have the options, I'll just add the semicolon, and the first option is that we are going to define if we want to save the tokens. So save tokens, and I'll just set it to true. The second option is going to be if we want to require HTTPS metadata. I'll just set it to false, so we are able to authenticate users even over HTTP requests. And the third and the most important option is the options token validation parameters. Now this is the part or this section where you define how you want to validate the token that comes from the clients. So for that, I'll just type equal to new token validation parameters, and I'll just remove this part. So just this part, and then here I'll just import the necessary namespace, and the necessary namespace is the Microsoft.identity model.tokens. And then inside here we are going to define all the properties. So the first property is that if we want to validate the issuer signing key, and we're going to set that to be true. So validate issuer signing key, that is true. But where does this key come from? So the issuer signing key is equal to new symmetric security key, and then we need to pass as a parameter the key from the application.json file. And to get the key in the Startup.cs, I'm just going to type encoding. So encoding, and then I'll just import the namespace, the system.text, and then dot ASCII dot get bytes. I want to get the value from the configuration, and then in the configuration we have the JWT section, so JWT and then secret. We are going to define if we want to validate the issuer. So validate issuer, and we are going to set the value to be true. But where does the issuer comes from? If you go to the app settings.json file, and here we have the issuer and the audience. So if you want, you can just remove the valid from here and just leave it as audience and issuer. Now these are not required. Actually, the most important part in here is the secret, because for the audience or the issuer, you can just set the values in here to be false, and then you don't need to provide these values. But having an issuer and having an audience just adds some complexity to the token validation parameters, which makes it more secure, which is better. So let us define the valid issuer, and the valid issuer is going to come from the configuration. So this part, Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V, and just issuer, because in the app settings.json file, we have just issuer. And then the other property is going to be the validate audience is equal to true, and then valid audience, so valid audience is equal to, and then just copy this part, just paste it in here, remove the comma, and then change the issuer to be audience, and then at the end I'll just add semicolons and save the changes. Now this is all you need to do to configure JWT authentication in a .NET Core Web API. You are going to set up the authentication controller. You are going to use the authentication controller to create new users, to add roles to the users, to generate tokens, refresh tokens, etc. So for that, let us go to Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, you need to go to the Solution Explorer, then inside the Controllers folder, we are going to add a new controller. And then in here, select the API controller -empty, and then click the Add button. Now you need to provide a name for the controller, and the name for this controller is going to be Authentication Controller, and then click Add. In here, we are going to inject a couple of services that we are going to use in the controller API endpoints. So let us start with the user manager. For that, I'll just type in here private, read only, then user manager, and this is a generic class, so I'll just pass as a parameter the application user, because this is the model that I use to store users in the database. And then I'll just name it underscore user manager. Then next, we are going to add the role manager. So for that, I'll just type in here private, read only, role manager, and then pass as a parameter the identity role class, because that is the class that we use to manage the user roles. So identity role, and the name is going to be underscore role manager. Now let us import the namespace for the user manager, and for the user manager the namespace is ASP.NET Core.identity. The same is for the role manager and the identity role, but we need to also import the namespace for the application user, and that is the data.models. Now if you hover over the user manager, you'll see that this provides APIs for managing user in a persistence store, which in our case is an SQL database, and the role manager provides the APIs for managing roles in a persistence store. Next, to interact with this persistence store or the SQL database, we use the appdb context. So for that, I'll just type in here private, read only, appdb context, so context, and then I'll just name it context. And then let us import the namespace. So the namespace for the appdb context is going to be the data. And then in here, I will also add the iConfiguration interface because we are going to need in the upcoming parts. So for that, private read only and iConfiguration. And we are going to name it underscore configuration. Now let us import the namespace for the iConfiguration, and that is the Microsoft.extensions.configuration. And now let us inject them all in the constructors. For that, I'll just create a constructor, cd_or, then double tab, and then I'll just copy the user manager. So Control C, paste it in here, comma. Then the role manager, Control C, paste it in here, comma. Then the appdb context, so Control C, then paste it in here. And the last one, the configuration, so Control C and paste it in here. I'll just remove the underscores from here so we can distinguish them from each other. So this is just context and this is just configuration. And now inside here, let us just assign the values. So the underscore user manager is going to be user manager. Then we have the role manager is equal to role manager. Then we have the underscore context that is going to be just context. And we have the configuration is equal to just configuration. Now this is all you need to do in this part. On the upcoming parts, we're going to create all the API endpoints step by step. On this part, you'll create the first API endpoint to register a new user. For that, let us go to Visual Studio and see it in action. In here, the first thing that we're going to do is that we are going to create the API endpoint, and that is going to be an HTTP post because we are going to send some data from the client side. But in our case, we are just going to use the postman. So I'm going to name this API endpoint register-user. And in here, we are going to create an async action result. So the response type is going to be public, async, and then task. This is going to be iAction result, and then register. Then in here, I'll just type from body. And in here, we are going to create a custom view model, but I'm going to name that view model register VM, and I'm just going to name the data payload. Now let us just go and create the register VM. So I'll just copy the name, Control C, then go to the Solution Explorer, and then in here go to the data folder. Inside the view models, I'm going to create a new folder. So add a new folder, and I'm going to name this folder just Authentication, because inside here I'm going to put all the authentication related view models. So just right click, then add a new class, and this is going to be the register VM, and then click the add button. Now the register VM is going to have three properties, so prop, and then this is going to be the first one, the username. The second property is going to be the email, so prop string email, and the third property is going to be the password, so prop string password. Now, if you want to make these fields required and actually validate if the user provided some values for these fields, you can just add the required annotation, so required, and then import the namespace, and that is from the component model.data annotations. And you can also provide an error message in case the user did not provide this value. So let us type in here, username is required. Now let us just copy this line, then paste it for the email. So this way we make the email property required as well. So email is required. And let us do the same for password. So I'll just copy this one, then paste it in here. Then just change the error message to be password is required. Now let us go back to the authentication controller, and I'll just import the namespace for the register VM, that is the viewModels.authentication. Now the first thing that we are going to do in here is that we are going to check if the user exists or not in our database. For that, var user exists is equal to, and for that we are going to use the user manager. So await the underscore user manager. Then in here you can use the helper class find by, and you can either use the find by ID, find by name, find by email, etc. Now, depending on what you want to have as a unique value in your database, for example, email or username, you can use that method. So for example, if you want to have the usernames as a unique value in your database, you can just use the find by name async, and then pass as a parameter the payload.username. If you want your email addresses to be unique, then in that case, you can just use the find by email async, and I'm actually going to use this method, and then pass as a parameter the payload.email. Now, if the user exists, so if the user exists is different from null, which means that we got some data from the database, we are just going to return a bad request, and the bad request will have a message user already exists. And if you want, you can also type in here $, and then after the user you have the payload.email already exists. Then if the user does not exist, you are going to create a new object of type application user, so application user, and this is going to be the new user is equal to new application user. And for the application user, we are going to define the email, and the email is going to be payload.email. Then we have the username, so username is equal to payload.username, and the third property can be the security stamp, so security stamp is equal to GUID.new GUID, and we need to convert the GUID to be a string, so dot to string. So now that we have the application user object, we need to set a password to this user and store the data in the database. For that, I'll just type in your var result is equal to await, going to use the user manager dot create a sync, and the first parameter is going to be the application user, so the new user. The second parameter is going to be the password. So for that, I'll just type in here payload.password. And then just after the result, we can check if the result was a success or not. So if the result is different from the succeeded, we are just going to return a bad request. So just a bad request of user could not be created. Otherwise, we can just return the created and then name of register and a message saying user created. Now, if you want, you can just copy this part. So Control C and paste it in here, and then just create it. Now let us save the changes and run the application. So the app ran. I'll just put a breakpoint in here and then start Postman. And then in here, I'll just create a new request. I'll just copy the URL from the browser and then just paste it in here. I'll change the API endpoint to be Authentication, and the endpoint is register-user. This is going to be an HTTP post. Then go to the body, and from here go to row and change the type from text to be JSON. And then in here, we're going to pass a JSON object. And in the JSON object, we're going to have 3 properties. And the properties in the register VM were the first property was the username. So username, and that is going to be, let's say, my full name. So Ervis Trupia. Then the second property is going to be the email. And that is just going to be test@test.com. And the third property is going to be the password. And the password is going to be, let us say, coding at 2021. And then that's it. Now let us just click the send button. So we reached the breakpoint. You can either press F10 or just this button up here. Then we check for the user. So the user does not exist. A new user object is created. And then by using the create async, we add the password to this user and store it in the database. Now we have a result. The result was a success. So continue. And here we have a response that the user was created. Now let us send another request. I'll just remove the breakpoint and click continue. And now we see that we get an error message, so a 400 bad request, which says that the user test@test.com already exists. On this part, you'll learn how to generate an access and a refresh token. For that, let us go to Visual Studio and see it in action. A refresh token is also known as a long-lived token, because the refresh tokens are generally available or valid for a period of up to 6 months. So the refresh tokens need to be stored in a database. For that, I'll just go to the Solution Explorer, and in here I'm going to add a new model. So in the data folder and then models folder, going to just right click, then go to add, and we are going to add a new class. I'm going to name this class refresh token and then click add. Now let us provide all the properties. So prop, the first property is going to be the ID property, so the identifier. Then prop, so the refresh token will belong to a user. String is going to be user ID. Then we are going to have the token itself, so the value of this token, so string token. Then we are going to have the JWT ID, so prop string JWT ID. And then we are going to have some validation properties like is revoked, etc. So in here, prop of type bool, I'm going to have the property is revoked. So in case the refresh token gets stolen, you can just revoke the refresh token and it cannot be used to generate a new token. Then we are going to have a property of date time. So date time, and the property name will be edit date, or let's say date edit. Then we are going to have an expiry time, so date time, and this is going to be date expire. And as we said, the refresh tokens are also known as the long-lived tokens, and they can be valid for up to a few months. Then at the end, we are going to add a reference to the application user table. So for that, I'll just type in here public application, so application user, and this is just going to be user. And if you want, you can just add the decorator in here. So this is going to be a foreign key. Let us import the namespace for the foreign key, and that is the component model.dataannotations.schema. And then in here, name of the user ID. And don't forget to add at the end the get and set. Now let us save the changes. Then in here, go to the Solution Explorer, then scroll down, go to the appdb context file, and then scroll down in here, and after the logs, then in here I'm just going to type prop, and this is going to be of type dbset, and the parameter is going to be the refresh token, and the name of this table is going to be refresh tokens. Now to add this table to the database, we need to add a new migration. So for that, I'll just type in here add dash migration, and this is going to be refresh tokens added. And then just update dash database. Now that the database is updated, let us go back to the authentication controller. And then just down here, I'm going to create a new method. This is going to be a private method. So private async, then task, and then the response is going to be a custom response. So let us just name it auth result VM, and then I'll just copy this name, go to the solution explorer, then here go to the view models. So inside the view models, then inside the authentication folder, I'm just going to add a new view model, so class. The name is going to be auth result VM, and then I'll just click the add button. So we have the auth result VM, and this is going to have three properties. The first property is going to be the access token, or just token, and this is of type string. Then next we are going to have the refresh token, and that is going to be of type string, so just refresh token. And the last property is going to be of type date time, and the name is going to be expires at. Now that we have the authentication result view model, let us just save the changes in here and go back to the authentication controller. I'll just right click in here and close all the tabs but this. And now we are going to create the generate JWT method. So in here I'll just name this method generate JWT token, and this will take as a parameter the application user, so application user, and then just user. Then the first thing that we are going to add will be the authentication claims, so var auth claims, and we said that claims are just properties for the application user. So var auth claims is equal to new list of claim. Now let us import the namespace for the claim, and that is the system.security.claims. This is going to be a list of claims. So let us create a new one, so new claim. This will take two parameters, the claim type, so claim types dot name, and let us set the claim types dot name to be user dot username. Let us also add another one, so Control C, Control V, and now we are going to add the name identifier claim, and the name identifier is going to be the user.id. Now we said that you can either add like public, private, or registered claims. Now let us add some registered claims. So for that I'll just type in here new claim, and then this is going to be JWT registered claim names. So let us import the namespace, and the namespace is going to be identity model.tokens.jwt. And for the claim names, we're going to use the email property. So email, that is going to be user.email. Let us also add another one, so Control C, Control V, and then Control V one more time. Next, let us just add the subject, and this subject is going to be email as well. And then at the end, we are just going to add the JTI, and the JTI is going to be a GUID, so GUID.new GUID, and then .to string. Then here let us just remove the comma and then add semicolon in here. Next we are just going to get the authentication sign-in key, so var auth sign-in key. And that is going to be the same as in the Startup.cs class. So I'll just go to the Solution Explorer. Then you scroll down to the Startup.cs. Then scroll down in here to the Configure Services method. And then in here we have the issuer signing key. Then I'll just copy this part, so Control C. Then come in here, signing key, then paste it in here. Let us import the namespace for the symmetric security key, and that is the identity model dot tokens. Then let us also import the encoding, and the encoding is going to be system.text. The configuration in here is the underscore configuration because we injected that in the previous part, and that's it. Now let us create the token. So var token is equal to new JWT security token, and then here we are going to define the issuer. The issuer is going to be the underscore configuration, and that is going to be the JWT issuer. Then next we have the audience, and the audience is going to be the audience in the app settings.json file. So just copy this part, paste it in here, change the issuer key to be audience. Then next we are going to set an expiry time, so expires. That is going to be datetime.utc now.add minutes. And I'm just going to set the minutes for testing purposes, just 1. So this means that the token will be invalid or will expire in 1 minute. The typical time is 5 to 10 minutes. Then next, I'm just going to set the claims, and the claims are going to be the auth claims. So Control C, Control V. And the last property is going to be the signing credentials, and the signing credentials is going to be new signing credentials, and it will take 2 parameters. The first parameter is going to be the auth signing key, so the auth signing key, and the second parameter is going to be the algorithm. So for that, I'll just type in here security algorithms dot, and then I'll choose the first option, so HMAC, then 256. At the end, I'll just add a semicolon, and now from this token, I'll generate a JWT token. So var JWT token is equal to new JWT security token handler, and then dot write token, and this will take as a parameter the security token, which is the token up here. Now the reason why we use the write token method is because if you hover over here, you'll see that this will serialize the JWT security token into a JWT in compact serialization format. So we have the JWT token. Now let us also generate a refresh token. So var refresh token is equal to new refresh token. And then in here, let us first define the JWT ID. That is going to be the token.id. Then the is revoked is going to be set to false. Then the user ID is going to be the user.id. Then next we have the date added. That is going to be the datetime.utc now, and the date expire is going to be the datetime.utc now.add months, and I'm going to set the expiry time for the refresh token to be 6 months. The last property is going to be the token itself, and in here you just need to generate a secure random string. So for that, I'll just use the GUID .new GUID .toString. If you want, you can also add another GUID So this is going to be separated by a dash. So GUID dot new GUID, and then dot to string. And then you need to add the refresh token to the database. So that is going to be await, then underscore context dot refresh tokens dot add async, then passes a parameter the refresh token object, then await context dot save changes async. Now let us construct the response as well. So var response is equal to, and the response is going to be an auth result VM object, so new auth result VM. This will have three properties, so the token, and the token is going to be the JWT token. The second property is going to be the refresh token, that is basically the refresh token dot token property, and the last property is going to be the expires at, and that is the token dot valid to. So the valid to, if you scroll up in here, comes from this expire. So when you set the expires, the valid to will be automatically generated. Then add in here a semicolon and then just return response. And this is how you can generate an access token, a refresh token, and an expires at. On this part, you'll learn about logging users in to the Web API. For that, let us go to Visual Studio and see it in action. In here, the first thing that we are going to do is that we need to create an API endpoint. So for that, I'll just go to the Solution Explorer and then here go to the Authentication controller. And just after the API endpoint for registering users, we are going to create another HTTP post. So HTTP post, and then in here, public async, then task action result. We are going to name this action result login, and then the login credentials will come from the request body. So from body, then here we are going to have login VM, and then just payload. Then let us change the default API endpoint to be login-user. And now let us create the login VM. So I'll just go to the Solution Explorer, then here inside the data folder, inside view models, then inside the authentication folder, I'll just add a new class. I'm going to name this class login VM and then click add. This will have two properties. The first property is going to be of type string, and that is going to be the email. And the second property will also be of type string, and I'll name it password. Now, if you want, in here you can add the required attribute, so required, and then import the namespace, which is the component model.data annotations. And if the user doesn't provide a value for the email address, then the error message is going to be email is required. Now let us just copy this part, Control C, then just paste it in here. Change the email to be password. Now just save the changes and go back to the authentication controller. And then in here, we are going to first check if the user exists in our database. So for that, var user is equal to await, and then I'm going to use the user manager dot find by name async, and I'll pass as a parameter the payload dot email. And if the user exists, we need to check if the password is valid. So if the user is different from null, and await underscore user manager dot check password async, and this takes two parameters. The first parameter will be the user, and the second parameter the payload.password. Then we are just going to generate a token value, so var token value is equal to await generate JWT token, which takes as a parameter the user. And then after you have the token value, you can just return OK token value. Otherwise, if the user does not exist, we're just going to return unauthorized. Now, to check if the user provided both the username and password, you can just check the model state. So if different the model state that is valid, then you can just return a bad request with the message, please provide all required fields. And you can also just copy this section, scroll up, and just paste it in here as well. So let us save the changes, and now let us just run the application. After the app runs successfully, open Postman, and I'll just close all the other requests. So just don't save. Close this one, and also this one. Now we can either use the existing user or we can just create another user. I'll just use the existing user. So Control C. Then I'll create a new request, and actually I'll just copy this one and just paste it in here. Change the API endpoint to be login-user. This is going to be an HTTP post. Then go to body, in here select row, and change the text to be JSON. I'll just go back to the other request and then just copy this whole section, Control C, and then Control V. I'll just remove the username and then click send. You can see that we get the unauthorized response. Now let us just go and create another user. So I'll just name the username to be ET. The email is going to be a@b.c, and then click send. So we see that the a.b.c was created. So let us go to the login, and I'll just change it to be a@b.c, and we didn't change the password. Then click send. So we are in here, continue, and we still get the unauthorized. Let us go back to Visual Studio one more time. And in here in line 79, we can see that we are using the wrong method. So instead of using the find by name async, we need to use the find by email async. So now I'll just save the changes one more time and run the application. And then here I'll just click the send button one more time. So we reached the breakpoint, and continue. And you can see that now we have a token, we have a refresh token, and an expires at. Now in here, let us create another request, and then this request will be of HTTP GET, and it will be on the API publishers get all publishers, and then click send. And you can see that we get all the publishers. Now let us go to the publishers controller and make the publishers controller only available to the authenticated users. So for that, let us just go back to Visual Studio, and I'll just stop Visual Studio, then go to Solution Explorer, and then go to the publishers controller. So here we do not have any decorators. What this means is that you can access the API endpoints within this controller without being authenticated. But if you add in here the authorize attribute, so authorize, and then import the namespace, which is the ASP.NET Core.Authorization, what this means is that to access any API endpoint within this controller, you need to be authorized. In this case, we have not defined any roles, so just being signed in is enough. So I basically need to be signed in to access any API endpoint within this controller. So I'll just save the changes now and run the app one more time. And then just go to Postman. And here now, since we added the authorized attribute, if you try to get data from this API endpoint, you get the 401 unauthorized error. Now, to overcome this problem, you need to use the access token. So let us just go to the post request for logging users in and then click send. I'll just remove the breakpoint, continue. And then here copy the new token value. So Control C, then just go to the HTTP GET request. Then here go to authorization. From the type, select the bearer token and then paste the token value in here. Now I'll just click send. But we can see that we still get the 404 unauthorized error, even though we passed as a parameter the access token. Now I'll just go back to Visual Studio one more time. And then here I'll just stop the application. Then here go to the Solution Explorer. Then Startup.cs, scroll down in here to the configure method, and just before the use authorization you need to also add another method, so authentication and authorization, and that method is app.use authentication, and then I'll just remove the extra space from here, save the changes and run the app one last time. Now that the app ran successfully, I'll just go to Postman. In here I'll generate a new token, so I'll just go to the post request for logging users in and then click send. Then I'll just copy the new token, Control C, go to the GET request, replace the old token and click send. And now you can see that we are getting some data and the user is being authorized using tokens. Now if you want to check the token details, you can just go to the authorization and copy the token and then go to the browser to the jwt.io and then here go to debugger. Then in the encoded part you can just remove the existing token and paste your token. And on the right, you'll see that the type of this token is JWT, the algorithm is SH256. Then in the payload section, you'll see claims like the name, the email, the subject, GTI, expiration time, issuer, and audience. And if you scroll down in here you'll have the signature. On this part, you'll learn how to generate a new access token using the refresh token. For that, let us go to Visual Studio and see it in action. In Visual Studio, the first thing that we need to do is that we need to create a new API endpoint. So for that, I'll just go to the Authentication controller and then scroll down in here. After the login, we are going to create a new controller. This is going to be HTTP post because we're going to post some data, and the API endpoint is going to be refresh-token. Then down here I'll just type public async task and then action result. The name is going to be refresh token. We are going to pass some parameters from the request body, so for that from body, and that is going to be a token request VM, which I'm just going to name payload. Now let us go and create the token request VM, so Control C, then go to the Solution Explorer, then inside the view models, inside the authentication, just add a new class. We are going to name this class the token request VM and then add. Inside this class we are going to have two properties of type string. The first one is going to be token, and the second one is going to be the refresh token. Now let us just save the changes in here and go back to the authentication controller. Then here I'll just add a new try catch block. I'm going to have some code in here, and then in case an exception is thrown, I want to return a bad request, which takes as a parameter the EX, so the exception message. Now inside the try and catch block, we are going to call a method. So let's say var result is equal to await, and then verify and generate token async. This will take as a parameter the payload, and then at the end, if the result is null, so we're going to check if the result is null, we're just going to return a bad request, and the bad request will just be invalid tokens. So this is going to be the response. Now the reason why we have in here verify and generate token is because before we generate a new token, we need to verify that the existing token was generated by our API. So this is what happens when the result is null, but otherwise we are just going to return the OK and then pass as a parameter the result. Now let us go and create the verify and generate token async method. So just after this API endpoint, I'll type private async task, and the response is going to be an auth result VM. Then we have the verify and generate token async, and this takes as a parameter the token request VM, and I'm just going to name it payload. Now here we are going to add some validations, and we are going to add them all one by one. But before we add any validation checks, let us create a JWT security token handler. So for that, I'll just type var JWT token handler is equal to new JWT security token handler. And now we are going to add all the validation. The first validation, so the validation one or the check one, will be to check the JWT token format. For that, we need to first inject the token validation parameters. So before we write any code in here, let us just scroll up to the constructor, and just after the configuration, we're going to have, I'll just type refresh tokens, and then private read only, then token validation parameters, then underscore token validation parameters. So I'll just add the underscore in here. Then I'll just copy this part, Control C, paste it inside the constructor. So token validation parameters, then scroll down in here and just say refresh tokens, and then assign the value to the underscore token validation parameters is equal to the token validation parameters. Now let us scroll down in here. So let us add the first check, and the first check is going to be var token in verification. So we're just verifying the token. That is going to be the JWT token handler dot validate token method. This will take two parameters as input, so the token, the validation parameters, and it will return a security token. So the first parameter will be the token, payload dot token. The second parameter is going to be the token validation parameters, and it is going to return an out var validated token. Now that we have the validated token, let us check from this token the second step. So check 2 is going to be to check the encryption algorithm. So for that, I'll just type if the validated token is JWT security token, and then I'll name the result JWT security token. And then in here, var result is equal to the JWT security token dot header dot algorithm dot equals. Then we're going to check the algorithm type, and that needs to be security algorithms dot HMAC, so the first option, and then string comparison dot invariant culture ignore case. Next, we need to just check if the result is equal to false, then just return null. Now let us add the third check, so check 3, and the check 3 is going to validate expiry date, so expiry date. For that, in here I'll get the expiry date, so var UTC expiry date is equal to long.parse, and then pass as a parameter the token in verification dot claims dot first or default, and from the claims we are going to get the claim, so x that goes to x dot type is equal to the JWT registered claim names dot exp, so for expiration dot value. Now let us convert the Unix timestamp to a date time. So for that, I'll just type in here var expiry date is equal to, and I'm going to create a new function, so Unix timestamp to date time in UTC, and this will take as a parameter the UTC expiry date. Now let us just copy this name and scroll down in here. Then I'll just type in here private date time. The name is going to be Unix timestamp to date time in UTC. Then long Unix timestamp. And then in here I'll just type var date time value is equal to new date time. And then here I'll just type 1970 1 1, then 0 0 0, and then one more 0. And then in here I'm going to set the date time kind to be UTC, and then date time value is going to be the date time value dot add seconds, and we are going to add the Unix timestamp. And then down here, just return the date time value. Now let us just click the reference and then click in here. So we are up here, and here we are going to check if the expiry date, so expiry date, is greater than the datetime.utc now. Then we are just going to throw a new exception, and the exception thrown is going to be token has not expired yet. Now let us add one more check, and this is going to be the check 4. And in the check 4, we're going to check if the refresh token exists in the database. For that, var db refresh token is equal to, and for that I'll just use the await underscore context dot refresh dot first or default async. And then in here I'll just type n that goes to n dot token is equal to the payload dot the refresh token. Now let us just import the first or default async, and that is part of the entity framework core. And then down here, if the DB refresh token is equal to null, then we're going to throw a new exception which says that the refresh token does not exist in our DB. But if it exists or else, then down here we're going to add another check, and this is going to be the check 5. Now we are going to validate the ID. So for that, var GTI is equal to the token in verification dot claims dot first or default, and from here we are going to get the X that goes to X dot type is equal to the JWT registered claim names dot GTI and then dot value. Now if the DB refresh token dot JWT ID is different from the GTI, then we're just going to throw a new exception, and token does not match is going to be the message. Then we are going to also check the expiry date for the refresh token. So for that, DB refresh token dot expiry date, so date expire, is less than or equal to actually datetime.utc now. Then we're going to throw a new exception. So throw new exception. And then I'm just going to type in here, your refresh token has expired. Please re-authenticate. Then we are going to also add one more check, and that is going to be the if DB refresh token is revoked, then throw new exception. Refresh token is revoked. And then at the end, so if all these tests are passed successfully, so we have in here the validation of ID, which is this one in here. Then we have in here the check 6, and that is going to be the refresh token expiration, the 6. And then we have in here the 7. So 7 refresh token revoked. So if all these checks are passed, a new token is generated. Now for that we need to first get the user data. So in here it will be generate new token with existing refresh token. And for that we need to first get the user data. So var db user data is equal to, and then I'll type in here await. We are going to use the user manager. So user manager dot find by ID async, and then I'll just type in here db refresh token dot user ID. Now that we have the user ID, we can generate a new token. So var new token response, and that is equal to generate JWT token. Now this will take a single parameter, so the application user, actually this one, db user data, but we are going to modify this method so it takes 2 parameters. So when we have a refresh token, so payload dot refresh token, it will take the payload dot refresh token. But when we don't have a refresh token, we are just going to pass as a parameter an empty string. So for that, I'll first remove the extra space. We can also change the name in here from generate JWT token to generate JWT token async. Then scroll down in here, change the name to be generate JWT token async. And the second parameter is going to be string refresh token. And now let us scroll down in here. So we have this refresh token. Let me actually scroll up and then change the name in here from refresh token to existing refresh token, and then Control C. Then scroll down in here. So we have the refresh token. But in here, before we add the new refresh token to the database, we are going to check if string that is null or empty the existing refresh token. So if we don't have an existing refresh token, then you can add the refresh token to the database. Actually, this whole part needs to be in here. So I'll just cut and then paste it in here. Now I'm just going to type in here var refresh token is equal to new refresh token. And then I'm just going to remove the var from here. So we have that the refresh token has now this value if the existing refresh token is null. Otherwise, the refresh token dot token will now be the existing refresh token. So I'll just add in here another check, and that is going to be if string is null or empty for the existing refresh token, then we have the new refresh token dot token. Otherwise, we are going to use the existing refresh token. Now, if you scroll up in here, you can see that we have an error in here. I'm just going to add semicolon. Then I'm just going to return await the new token response. Now let us scroll up some more. And now in here, the token value generate JWT token async. The second parameter will be just an empty string. And in this case, a new refresh token will be generated and saved in our database. Now, before we test this functionality, one more thing that we need to do is that we need to go to the Solution Explorer. Then you go to the Startup.cs and then scroll down in here. Then just go to the new token validation parameters. And then I'll select the new token validation parameters section. So Control X, I'll just cut it, then scroll up in here. Just before the add identity, we are going to add the token validation parameter. So token validation parameters. And I'm just going to name it var token validation parameters. And now that we have added the refresh token, I'm going to also set the validate lifetime is equal to true. But since that for testing purposes, we have set the lifetime of an access token less than 5 minutes, we need to also set in here the clock skew is equal to time span dot 0, because by default the access tokens have a lifetime of 5 minutes, and we need to override that property by using the clock skew. For that, we need to set the clock skew time span dot 0 because it defaults to 5 minutes. Now let us just scroll down in here. Actually, we need to first copy this value, then scroll down, and then just paste it in here. Then semicolon, save all the changes, and run the application. Now I'll just go to the post request for logging users and then click send. So now here we get an error with the message unable to resolve service for the identity model.tokens.token validation parameters. And that's right, we just forgot to add that. So I'll just stop Visual Studio. And then in here, just before the add identity, I'll type services dot add singleton and then pass as a parameter the token validation parameters. Now, the reason why we need to configure the token validation parameters is because we have injected the token validation parameters in the authentication controller. So if you scroll up in here, we have injected in here the token validation parameters. And for this injection to work, you need to update the Startup.cs. So let me start Visual Studio one more time. And I'll just go to Postman and then click the send button one more time. And now you can see that we get a token, we get a refresh token as well. So let us just copy this post, create a new request. This is now going to be refresh-token. This is going to be an HTTP post. If you go to the body, then in here go to row and change the text to be JSON. Then I'll just go to the post request and I'll send just another one so we can get a new token. Then select all this data, come in here, paste it in here and remove the expires at, and then click the send button. We see that the token has not yet expired. And we know that the access token has a lifetime of 1 minute, so we need to wait for 1 minute. But meanwhile, I'll just remove the E from the end and click send. Now we can see that the error is different and it says that the signature validation failed because this is different now from the original token that the web API generated. So I'll just add E and then click send. Now it says that the lifetime validation failed. The token is expired. So the token has expired now. So let us just go to Visual Studio. And in Visual Studio, I'll just stop the app. Then in here, I'll enable the exceptions. So I'll just search in here for exceptions and then go to the exception settings. And then click on the common language runtime exceptions because I want to see what is the exception type for the validate token. And then just run Visual Studio one more time. Then I'll open Postman and then in here I'll just send another request and we see that the exception thrown is of type security token expired exception. Now what I'll do in here is that I'll just copy this exception name, Ctrl+C, then stop Visual Studio, and then I'll wrap the whole code in a try catch block. So just in here I'll type try, and then I'll catch just the exceptions of type security token expired exception. Then I'll get all this code, including all the checks. So until here, Ctrl+X, and then just paste it up here. And if an exception of type security token expired is thrown, I want to just generate a new token. So then I'll just paste it in here. And then we need in here the DB refresh token. So I'll just copy this one as well. So Ctrl+C and then just paste it up here. And then we just need to save the changes. Now, if you want, you can also add another catch because we can have multiple catch blocks. And then this is going to be just the exception type. And then I'll name it EX. Because if you scroll up in here, we have multiple cases where, for example, the DB refresh token is revoked. We just throw a new exception. So let us just scroll down in here. And here we can basically just throw a new exception. And as a message, we just pass the ex.message. Now let us just save the changes and run the app one more time. And then go to Postman. Then here go to the post request for logging a user in and then click send. So now we have a new token and a refresh token. Ctrl+C, then go to the post request for refreshing a token, then Ctrl+V, and then click send. So an exception is thrown that the token has not yet expired. Just continue. It is catched by the second catch block. Continue. And I'm just basically just going to remove the break and then continue. Now, if I use this token, so Ctrl+C in the HTTP GET request and click send, we see that we get some data. So now I'll just wait for the token to expire, and it takes around 1 minute. Now let us try again. So we see that the token is now expired and we cannot get data from the API publishers get all publishers API endpoint. So let us go to the post and then in here click send. We see that we get the security token expired exception. So let us click continue. And now we can see that a new token will be generated and the refresh token is the same. So let us copy the new token, Control C, and then go to the get. In here, if I click send with the old token, we cannot get data. So let us just replace the old token with the new one and then click send. And now you see that you get some data. So far, you have just learned how to check if the users are authenticated or not. But in an app, you normally have roles, and the users would be given access just to certain areas of the app based on their roles. For example, a publisher can access the publisher controller, an author can access the books and the authors controller, and an admin can access all the controllers. On this part, you'll learn how to add roles to token-based authentication. For that, let us go to Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, before we write any code related to the role-based authentication, we are going to add to the database the default roles that we want to have in our app. For that, I'll just go to the Solution Explorer, and then in here I'll go inside the data folder, then View Models, and then Authentication. In here, I'll just add a new class, and I'm going to name this class User Roles and click Add. Now I'm going to make this class a static class, and then inside here I'm going to define all the roles, so const string admin, and the value for the admin is going to be admin. I'm going to have some more roles, so Control C, Control V, Control V, Control V. The second role is going to be a publisher. So in here I'll just type publisher. Then I'm going to have the author role, so author. Then the user. Now that we have the role, let us just go to the Solution Explorer. And then in here scroll down to the appdb initializer. And then in here, just after the seed method, we are going to create another method that we are going to use to seed the roles to the database. For that, I'll just type in here public static async task, and then the name is going to be seed roles. This is going to take as a parameter the application builder, and then I'll just name it application builder. And then inside here we are going to create a scope for the application services. So for that I'll use the using block, so using, and then var service scope is equal to the application builder dot application services dot create scope. Now inside here, since we are going to create roles, I'll use the role manager service. So for that I'll just type var role manager is equal to the service scope dot service provider dot get required service, and then I'll pass as a parameter in here the role manager. So let us import the role manager namespace, and that is the ASP.NET Core.identity. And for the role manager, the class is going to be the identity role. Now let us just add parentheses at the end. And now in here we are going to check for all the roles if they exist or not in our database, and if they do not exist, we are going to add them to our database. So let us start with the admin one. So if the await, so different from the await role manager dot role exists async, and then we are going to use the user roles So let us import the namespace for the static class user roles. So viewModels.authentication and then .admin. So if we do not have in our database an admin role, we are just going to await role manager .create async. So we are going to create a new role. So new identity role, and then pass the parameter in here, the user roles. So user roles .admin. Now I'm just going to copy, so Ctrl+C, and then just paste it in here for the other roles. And then we are going to check the publisher, and then just add a publisher to the database. The other one will be an author, and then just add the author to the database if it does not exist. And the last one is going to be the user role, and then just in here, user. Now let us just go to the Solution Explorer, and then in here go to the Startup.cs, then scroll down here to the configure method, and then at the end I'm just going to type appdb initializer, but now we are going to use the seed roles method. This will take as a parameter the iApplication builder, so the app, and then since this is async, I'll just wait the execution. Now let us just save the changes, and now go to the Solution Explorer, and then in here go to the register vm.cs, and in here let us add another property for the role. So I'll just copy the password and paste it down here. From string password, I'll change it to string role, and then add a message in here, role is required. Now let us go to the authentication controller, and then scroll up in here to the register API endpoint. So now basically we are going to pass as a parameter in here the role as well, and then scroll down in here. So we are creating the user, and after we create the user, we are going to add this user to a role. So let us just scroll down in here just before we have the return created. We are going to add the user to the role, and for that in here I'm going to use a switch block. So switch, and then we are going to switch on the payload.role, and the first check is going to be if the case is admin. So if the role is admin, then await, and then we are going to just use the user manager. So user manager .add to role async, and we are going to add this new user to the user roles .admin, and then here just break. Then we are going to check for the second role and third role, and by default we are just going to add the user to the user role. So just down here, that is going to be user. And then here we're going to check for the other cases. So we have a user, we have an admin, but we also have a publisher and an author. So we are just going to add the publisher in here, and the other one is an author. So then change the user roles.admin to be user roles.publisher, and the .admin in here to be .author. But now when you generate the JWT token, you need to also add the roles to that token. So for that, I'll just scroll down in here to the generate JWT token, and then just before the token, or actually just before the auth signing key, I'll just add the roles. So add user roles, and that is going to be var user roles is equal to await. For that, I'm going to use the user manager, and then the get roles async method, which takes as a parameter the user. So now that we have the roles, we need to add the roles as claim types to the auth claims. So for that, for each var user role in the user roles. Down here, I'm going to add to the auth claim some new claims. So auth claims dot add, and we're going to add new claim, and that is going to be the claim type. So claim types dot role, and that is going to be the user role. Now this is all you need to do in here, so let us just save the changes and then just go to the Solution Explorer, then scroll up in here to the controllers folder, and then open the authors controller. Let us decorate the authors controller with the authorize attribute, so authorize, then import the namespace, and that is the ASP.NET Core.Authorization. And let us set in here the role to be author. So only authors can access these API endpoints. For that, I'll just type in here roles is equal to the user roles dot author. Let us import the namespace, and this is going to be the viewModels.Authentication. Then let us just go to the other controllers. So next is the publishers controller, and in the publishers controller we are going to set the roles are equal to the user roles dot, let's say, publisher. So I'll just import the user role, and then for the logs controller we are going to set the authorize, but for the user roles, so just authorize, but for the roles I'm going to set the user roles dot admin, just authentication. Now I'm just going to save the changes, and then I'll just save actually all the changes. Then I'll just go to the Solution Explorer, Authentication Controller, and then scroll down in here. I'll just change the add minutes to be just, let's say, 10. So the access token doesn't expire after 1 minute, and then just run the application. Now that the app ran successfully, we get 401, so unauthorized. I'll just close the browser and then go to the Server Explorer. Then in here, I'll just go to the My Books-DB because that is my database, and then tables. And inside the tables, I'll just go to ASP.NET Roles, just right click and then show table data. And you can see that now in here we have the 4 roles that we added. So we have the admin, we have the publisher, the author, and the user. Now let us run the app one more time. And I'll just go to Postman. And then here I'll just go to the first post request because I want to create a new user. The username is going to be admin user. The email is going to be admin at, let's say, admin.com. I'm going to leave the password the same, but we need to also provide a role, because if we do not provide a role, when you click send, it will say that the role is required. So the role for this user is going to be admin, and then click send. So the user admin at admin.com was created. Now let us create a publisher user. So publisher is going to be publisher at publisher.com, and then the role is going to be publisher, and then click send. Then next, let us also create an author user, so author, and then this is going to be author at author.com. The role is going to be author, then send. So a new user was created. Now let us just create the user, or just a user role. So user, then user at user, and then the role is going to be just user. Then click send. Now I'll just copy the email and password and just go to the second post. and then just paste them in here. So we are going to have an admin at admin.com and then click send. So now we have in here the token, and if you want, we can just copy the token, Control C, and then go to the jwt.io, and then here go to debugger, then just replace the old token with your token. And if you scroll down in here in the payload, you can see that part of the identity claims name is admin user, and in here we have the role admin. Now let us go back to Postman. In here, if you go to the API endpoint to get the publishers, and then just use the token in here and click send, you'll see that you get the 403 error. So it's not the 401. What this means is that the server is able to authenticate you as a user, but you do not have the role to access the publishers, because we have set the get all publishers to be accessible only from the publisher roles. Now let us just copy the get all publishers, Control C, and just create a new request. And this is going to be for the logs. So if we go back to Visual Studio, and then here go to the Solution Explorer, the logs controller, we have set in here that we want to authorize the admins. And inside this controller, we have an API endpoint, this one. So Control C. Let us go back to Postman. And this is going to be API logs. And this is the API endpoint, and then click send. Now in here we see that we get a 401, and that's right because we have decorated the logs control with the authorize. So we need to provide the token value. For that, I'll just go to the post request for the login and then just get the token. So Control C, and then go to the get. In here, go to authorization, the beer token, and then just paste it in here, and then click send. And now you can see that we have a result. Now let us just go to the post request one more time, and now instead of logging in the admin, we are just going to log in a publisher. So publisher, and then publisher, and click send. We got a token. I'll just copy the token, Control C. If you want, you can just go to the jwt.io, and here just replace the old token. So I'll just replace this token. And now if you scroll down in here, you can see that the role is publisher. So let us go back to Postman. Then in here, go to the HTTP GET for the publishers, and then just replace the old token with the new one and click send. And now you can see that we get the publishers. Now let us just go to Visual Studio. And I'll just stop the app and then go to the publishers controller. And in here, if you want the publishers controller to be accessed by both publishers and the admins, you can add as many roles as you want in here by separating them with a comma. So for example, we have the publisher. Let us say we want to also add the admin. We just need to separate them with a comma. And then you can just type in here user roles dot admin. You can also add roles in API endpoint level. So for example, if you go to the Solution Explorer and then in here go to the books controller, if you want, you can set the get all books to be accessed by an admin. So let us just type in here authorize, and let's import the namespace, and this is going to be the user roles. So the roles is going to be user roles. Let's import the namespace dot admin, or let us just make this dot author. So an author can get all books, but if you want to get a book by ID, then you need to be an admin. So user roles dot admin. And here at the top, you can either add the authorized attribute or not. So I'll just save all the changes and run the app one more time, and then go to Postman. Then here I'll first sign in as a publisher, so send. Then copy the token value, Control C, and then just paste it in here. So we get some data. Now let us go and sign in as an admin, so admin@admin.com and send. Let us copy the token value and try to access the same API endpoint. Then send, and now you can see that we get a response. Now let us try and sign in as an author. So author@author.com, send. Let us copy this API endpoint and then change the publishers to be books, and then get all books, and then just paste the value in here and click send. We see that we get a 200 status code, which is a success, but the response is just an empty array because we do not have any books in the database. But if you try to access the other API endpoint, if you go to Visual Studio, you'll see that the other one needs to be accessed just by an admin. So I'll just Control C and then just go to Postman. So the other API endpoint that needs to be accessed just by the admins, let us say just one, send. You can see that we have the 403 forbidden. So let me just go and sign in as an admin. So admin, and then click send, copy the token value, and then just paste it in here, click send. Now you can see that you get the 204 no content, which means that the user was able to authenticate and authorize. We talked about token-based authentication and authorization. For that, you first learned about the difference between authentication and authorization, because these two concepts, even though are simple, a lot of developers have a hard time distinguishing them from each other. Then next, you learned about the differences between the traditional or the cookie-based authentication and the token-based authentication. But before you wrote any code, you also learned about the JSON web tokens. Throughout this course, you had already used the Entity Framework Core to interact with data in your database, and you used the Entity Framework Core to set up the authentication as well. Like for example, you used the Entity Framework Core to create the tables, to store the user-related data, to get data from the database, etc. You also learned how to generate an access and a refresh token, and also how to generate a new access token when the existing access token expired using a refresh token. By the end of this course, you also learned about the role-based authentication.